Welcome to Current Affairs. My name is Nathan Robinson. I'm the editor-in-chief of Current Affairs magazine. And today I am joined by political philosopher Ingrid Robeyns. She is the author of the new book, Limitarianism, The Case Against Extreme Wealth. Professor Robeyns, welcome to Current Affairs.
Thank you for having me.
Well, let's start with the viewpoint that your book is in many ways a response to. Certainly very common here in the United States. That view, I suppose, could roughly be summarized as poverty is a problem. Poverty is very sad. We don't like it when people are poor and they suffer. But inequality is not a problem. It doesn't matter how much people at the top have. It matters how much people at the bottom have, but there should be no upper limit to wealth. As long as the economic pie is growing and the poor are getting richer, it doesn't matter if the rich are getting much richer. They create wealth, what have you. Why should we care about the top, the upper limit discussed in your book? So we'll get into all of the many reasons. I know your book lays out many reasons, but just as a broad overview, the first time someone says, when you're sitting there, you hear that talking point, where do you begin?
Yeah, so it depends on the person I'm having a conversation with. But I think, so inequality, there's a lot of older research that has shown that inequality in itself actually has negative effects on society, on the social determinants of health. So unequal societies are more unhealthy than equal societies. And there's all that research. My book and my argument focuses specifically on the wealth concentration at the top, because that causes particular problems. Basically, concentration of wealth means concentration of power, means concentration of the ability to pollute the environment. And so there are all these harms and damages that wealth concentration can do. That's one important line of argument.
Well, what I've heard before, the line I've heard before is the poor are not poor because the rich are rich, meaning that the rich could gain a lot more wealth and the poor could gain a lot more wealth at the same time. We say, oh, people at the top are contributing to their stockpile, but it's also true that the poor are getting. Do you think it is true that the poor are not poor because the rich are rich, or are the poor poor because the rich are rich?
Yeah, I fear that all the research I've put together in the book does support the point of view, or the point of view that the poor remain relatively poor also because the rich just take a very big slice of the pie. So it is possible, in theory, that the rich would become rich and the poor would also get out of poverty and the middle classes would rise too. But what we've seen is that both if you look at this globally, but also within countries, that the economies grow. They've grown tremendously over the last decades, but basically the rich have taken the lion's share of what we collectively produce.
Yeah.
And then there's also, I think, particularly relevant for the US, there's the book by the Princeton sociologist Matthew Desmond, who also has written a whole book arguing that actually the title of the book is already revealing. The title is Poverty, by America, which means he attributes the persistence of poverty in the US to the way America has chosen to organize its policies and the political and economic choices they make. And one of the arguments he makes is that anything that has to do with material policies, so housing, fiscal policies, and so on, it is a zero-sum game. So if you give tax deductions to the richest, then it means you do not have the tax revenues that you could give to, say, public housing policies or any other type of policies that benefit poor.
Yeah, Matthew Desmond came on the program a few months ago and discussed how, the role of exploitation, the role of wealth concentration in perpetuating poverty. Now, you said the words zero sum there, and I want to dwell on that for a little bit, because I read a book a couple of years back by a couple of followers of Ayn Rand called Equal is Unfair. And one of the things they said is that wealth is not zero sum. It's not like a pie. They call it the pie fallacy, The pie fallacy, they say, is that wealth is like a pie, where if I get a little bit more, you necessarily get a little bit less. And they say it's not like that because everyone's amount of pie can be growing. But you said that in some ways, wealth is zero sum, in that there are choices that we have to make about alternate uses, where in some instances, if you're not spending money on one thing, you're spending it on another.
Yes. So I should say it is true that in economic policies, we have both zero-sum policies or choices, and we also have positive-sum situations. And what we've seen is that both globally, but also within countries, the economies have grown, which means really the pie has become bigger. But then the question is, the additional pie, the additional growth, how is that divided? And there, what the data that I discuss in the book show is that literally we've given crumbles to the poorest.
Right. They're not getting a slice of pie.
No. Well, even on globally, we've been able to lift some of the absolutely poor out of poverty. And because that poverty line is so low, it's actually not that difficult to pull them out. But the 1% has just massively increased their wealth. So I think that it's true that it's a question about, does the pie, if you want to use that metaphor, does it become bigger? But you also always have to ask, how is it divided? And what are alternative ways to divide it than the one we currently have?
One of the things you do, as you've indicated there, is you go into the data, because there's this popular website called Our World in Data. Steven Pinker has presented a lot of this data as well. And essentially, the kind of most famous finding, or one of the most commonly discussed, is the number of people over the course of the past decades that have been supposedly lifted out of extreme poverty. And this is often the defense given of inequality, is you say, yes, we live in a very unequal world, but there are all these people who would once have been very, very poor, and now they're not. You point out that in some ways, that comes from just setting an extremely low line so that it's really easy to push people over it. And in some ways, it's almost like a magic trick, or it's almost like it's not as real of a gain as it's being presented as.
Yeah, so I think in all fairness, it is true that the number of people living in absolute poverty has decreased massively. So I think that is what the data show us. But there are two big disclaimers to that claim. And one is, as you just mentioned, that poverty line is very, very low. So it's around $2 a day, but that's not like $2 in, say, Antananarivo, the capital of an African country, but it is what you could buy with $2 in the US. So it's what economists call purchasing power parity. So it's extremely low poverty line. Most development economists say that you should put that line at $11. And then, of course, the number of people that are still living in extreme poverty is much, much higher. So that is one problem with the optimistic interpretation of the data. But the other one is, so the way I've written this book and the way I look at these phenomena is in thinking about, okay, what were the possible scenarios we could have? So I'm not looking at, okay, where were we and where are we? And is that an improvement? But where were we? Where could we also have been? Right. And would some of these scenarios have been better? And it's clear that we have a scenario that for the absolute poor is, at least on a global level, is better than it was some decades ago. But there were alternative scenarios in case the 1% and even the 10% would not have pursued endless accumulation of their wealth, where we could have given them more money, and then we would have had a much bigger reduction in not just extreme poverty, but also just poverty in general. So you see, with all these elements, you just see that the question about inequality and poverty are intrinsically related, and that's logical because in the end, they're both aspects of the distribution of money.
So if I could try and summarize, one of the things I see you saying there is, so we can have a story that says, look at all these people who have been drawn out of extreme poverty because they used to make, less than $2 a day. Now they make more than $2 a day. Maybe they make $3 a day. And we look at this as a great victory and we say, yes, the rich have earned a lot of money, but a lot of these people have been drawn out. But what you're saying there is, well, hang on a minute. there was another alternate world where they didn't go from $1 a day to $3 a day. Again, as you said, in United States dollars, meaning try to live on $3 a day, like you would live on it in the United States. I mean, what if there wasn't this kind of wealth concentration and they had gotten to a much more reasonable amount, like $15 a day or $20 a day?
Yeah, no, that's exactly what it is. And actually, I should say that all the data in the book, except one study that I did together with colleagues of mine who are economic sociologists, are data of economists and people who have as a profession that they analyze the data. So I'm just reporting on them and using them in my normative analysis. And these particular data are from Jason Hickel, the economic anthropologist, and the analysis is also from him. One of the narratives that we are presented with is that the increase in income for different income groups has been the biggest for, say, the middle classes on a global scale. But he pointed out that this is when you look at percentage increases. But if you have almost nothing,
right,
and say you have $2 a day and you go to $4, it's a doubling of your income.
Right.
But if you have an income of, let's just say 50 million a year, and you go to 55 million a year, it's not such a big increase, but still you earned another 5 million.
Yeah.
And he basically then calculated what the absolute increases were. And then you just see again that the richest have benefited most from, to use the metaphor, the increasing pie. And so I mean, but of course, that means the pie we produce together. And that is important to see because many of our, say, folk wisdom approaches to anything to do with economics is very individualistic. But I think we should go back to the founder of economics, Adam Smith, who already showed that we in the end produce those things together. And you always have inevitably a question about distribution.
So you could have a situation where you say, well, the people at the bottom, their wealth has doubled. And the people at the top, they've only gained 5 or 10%. And you say, well, so inequality isn't increasing that much. It's benefiting everyone. But then you say, well, okay, but what would an extra $5 million that went to those at the top, what could that have done if it had instead flowed to someone else?
Absolutely.
You point out that when additional wealth goes to the top, it is doing less work than if it goes to the bottom. On a sort of crude utilitarian analysis, how much use can any given person get out of additional wealth? If you're a billionaire, each additional dollar is virtually meaningless. Whereas if you are a person who is earning $2 a day, each additional dollar is really, really important to you. So as wealth is created, I guess that should make us sort of lean towards favoring, it should go to the people with the least.
Yes, and this is an old finding from both economics and political philosophy. It's called the declining marginal utility or value of money, which means that the more you have, each additional dollar is contributing less to your well-being, your happiness, your flourishing. And of course, one could ask, well, then why do the super rich, do they want to accumulate money? Because that's one of the findings from the ethnographic and sociological research is that we see that among the super rich, there's a small group that really deliberately is giving away their money. I mean, we can talk about them also, but the largest group really just keeps being focused on accumulation. And there, the available psychological research seems to suggest two mechanisms. One is comparison, so it's a status issue. So you compare yourself with the next person in the Forbes list or in another list, and you just want to have more than your millionaire or billionaire neighbor. And the other one is that it seems to be like an addiction. So you just seem like to always want more and shifting the goalposts. And there is a very interesting, I mean, it's been a bestseller, but this little book called The Psychology of Money also documents this, that if you keep shifting the goalposts, you will also sometimes do stupid things or sometimes even evil things in order to get to the next goalpost. And one of my arguments is that why at some point should you want to shift the goalpost? Because you really have everything you can reasonably want for a really, really, really good life. And that is really a claim that's kind of not really in our culture. Our culture is literally the sky's the limit, whereas the approach I'm trying to defend, and which goes back all the way to Aristotle, is no, the sky shouldn't be the limit. There's a limit to how much we should want, because a good life is also a life within boundaries.
Yes, an interesting argument that you make in the book is that this ceaseless pursuit of accumulation, where nothing is ever enough, ultimately harms the super rich themselves. I mean, you point out, you cite the wonderful Generation Wealth book by Lauren Greenfield, who studied the lives of the rich and their children. And oftentimes being a child in just really, really extreme wealth has damaging effects. And certainly this idea that the only meaning you could get out of your life comes from improving your bank account endlessly is not good for people.
Yeah, no, that's true. And I also, for the book, I interviewed multimillionaires. And of course, I must make the disclaimer that multimillionaires I interviewed are not representative for all the millionaires and billionaires, because clearly some of them had no interest to speak to me. But they actually confirmed this, that if you grow up very rich, how will you ever know that what you accomplish is really your own? Because everything has been set up for you to succeed.
Well,
if you are just living an ordinary life, a middle-class life, or even in the case of poverty, whatever you succeed, you will have to really put in a big effort.
Well, we often hear incentives invoked as an argument for allowing the accumulation of large-scale wealth, right? If you tax away people's money, they won't want to work hard. But it's also true that if you inherit a pile of money, that creates pretty bad incentives too. Why should you do any work?
No, but that's true. And actually, the funny thing is that I've also done research on the ethics of inheritance. And in this respect, both economists and political philosophers agree that inheritance taxation is one of the most rational taxations we can have, precisely because of what you say. There's no incentive effects. If you inherit money, it's actually, there is an incentive effect in the sense that, but in the bad sense.
Right.
That you will basically say, oh, if I get that big amount of money, I'll just stop working.
Right.
But also that if you tax it, it doesn't really make a big difference to how much people will save. So the people who give the money. And then there is the fundamental philosophical argument that you don't deserve inheritance because you did nothing in order to get an inheritance. But the funny thing is that in the case of inheritance taxation, the feelings that people have are very opposite to it. And I think they are the reason why we have these strong emotions against inheritance taxation is because it has to do with family ties. And some people may also have these strong emotions because they think the government is evil and hence they don't want the government, but then they are against any type of taxation. But I think most people seem not to realize is that the vast majority of people actually don't get an inheritance. So the problem is not so much with inheritance per se. The problem is that some inherit nothing and others inherit millions. And then you get unequal opportunities from the start.
I actually once looked up what Ayn Rand said about inheritance because I'm always curious, how are you going to justify something that seems pretty impossible to say that you earned it or you deserve it? And essentially, if I recall her argument correctly, she said something like, well, yes, it's completely arbitrary and there's no fairness to it. But she said, but my question is, why does the state have the right to take it away?
Yeah.
So it's an interference in private arrangements within families. Might not be fair, but there's no reason that society should get to put that wealth to alternate uses. How do you respond to that?
Yes. So because I can see that reasoning, and I should also say, we shouldn't be naive about the state and the government, because actually many countries have governments that are imperfect, to put it mildly, but sometimes really pretty disastrous. So what I propose in my book and also in my scholarly work is that we were to limit the amount you can inherit, but then all that is being collected in terms of taxation of inheritance money goes 100% back to the citizens. It doesn't go to the state, but it goes to those who will not inherit anything otherwise. So that means that we will provide all people, and I would really give it to young people because they need it most to get a kickstart in life, either to get the beginning of a mortgage or to set up a small business or something like that. it will give all of them this foundation to build their lives. And you can think about designs that keep the state out. And so that, I think, might be an answer to the libertarians. I should also say that in political philosophy, we call them the right-wing libertarians and the left-wing libertarians, or the right libertarians, left libertarians. But the left libertarians actually are in favor of full abolition of inheritance. So I still want to accommodate in my proposal. I want to accommodate to some extent the fact that there is this relationship between parents and children, or an adult and a significant other person. So I do want to accommodate the fact that money is not just purely a transaction, but there's also something about sometimes a relationship. But I just think we should limit it, because it is the endless inequalities in inheritance that create the problems and that also undermines equality of opportunity. And I think everybody is in favor of equality of opportunity.
Yeah, you hear that from right to left, although people often use that as a piece of rhetoric without thinking about what it would really mean to have equality of opportunity, which would require quite a radical restructuring of, economic distribution if you're going to have real equality of opportunity.
I actually think I argue in the book that having a limit to how much wealth you can have but then on the assumption that what would be collected would be used in a way that increases the opportunity of the worst off. It would increase the total opportunities of people, and also it would bring us much closer to this ideal of equality of opportunity. And equality of opportunity is really, as you rightly say, a principle or a goal that everybody seems to support. We just haven't thought through what this requires from us.
As you're talking, I keep thinking back to what you've said about, the kind of squandered possibilities here that inequality is creating. Really, we're hurting ourselves ultimately. You talked about how, okay, well, if the people who don't inherit anything, if they did get something, if they did have an amount of money, they could use it. They could put it to, they could start an enterprise. They could put a down payment on a house. They could make their children better off, get their children better educated, a richer life. Maybe one of them could quit work and they could be a better parent, because they're not working all the time. There are all sorts of things that would be socially beneficial if people who didn't have money did have money.
Yeah, no. So, but that is actually again, this follows from the declining marginal utility of money. So that is an important kind of premise under my argument, is that at some point, what money does, if you have already a lot, it's only in the realm of status, perhaps psychology to the person that, but it doesn't really materially make a difference.
You're listening to the Current Affairs podcast from Current Affairs magazine in New Orleans, Louisiana. Current Affairs is a registered 501c3 nonprofit organization, and we depend entirely on reader subscriptions and donations. You'll notice we have no ads, no mattresses, no recruiters, no sports betting. If you can help us in our mission to build independent progressive media, please visit currentaffairs.org/donate to make a donation, or currentaffairs.org/subscribe to subscribe to our beautiful print magazine. Thank you so much for supporting our work. Now, back to the program. I think it's such an important concept, this declining marginal. It sounds like people might think of it as a technical economics term, but just when you try to understand it in plain language, which is that, wealth given to people who are living on the streets means so much more to them than,
absolutely.
I don't know how much Elon Musk made in the time that we've been speaking, but it's probably millions of dollars.
Yeah, no, and I guess if you were to ask older people, somewhat older people, not necessarily old people, but older people like me, when I was a student, I started out with no money, and now I'm a professor, so I have a very decent salary. It really is the case that at some point when you don't have much, and you then have you earn some money or something, you can really do a lot with it. If you are comfortably off, what you see that prudent people will do is they will just start saving. And then, of course, and that's logical because you want to have a cushion for when something happens, and you have to, in most countries, you have to save for your pension. And then we're still talking about the middle classes. But if you're talking about the rich, once you have so suppose you have covered your pension needs and your healthcare needs, and then you have 1 million. I mean, and then another million and another million. What do you do?
Yeah.
So it's just a number on your bank account. Or I should say not on your bank account, on your investment account.
Now, we're talking there about how, at a certain point, this additional wealth becomes meaningless where it could be put to other better uses. But you also discuss in the book the ways in which this concentration of power through concentration of wealth is very damaging and dangerous, because extreme wealth, in fact, does confer a lot of political power. And you talk about the fact that, it's not just, they're getting a lot of numbers on a spreadsheet and we could do better. It's a bad idea to have people with, a certain amount of power.
Yes, absolutely. And here, I think political scientists have done very important research, also comparing different countries. And the way that the super rich basically undermine the principle of political equality, so basically one person, one vote, or equal political influence, is by sponsoring parties or candidates. And then there was, I quote in the book, a very famous passage of Donald Trump when he was interviewed, when at the time he gave money to both, that was before he was in politics himself, and he gave money to the Republicans and the Democrats. And then the journalist asked, why do you do this? And then he said, well, because whoever will be in power, I will have somebody to call up and they will do what I ask
quite
from
blunt.
them. Yeah. And so the thing is that, of course, this is rational. I mean, it's rational to assume that if people give large amounts of money, they're doing this because he who pays the piper calls a tune, right? So that's a saying. And we all know this from our own lives, that, I mean, there are favors and there are favors you give back. But that's one mechanism. But the other mechanism is lobbying. It's a very important one. If you have money, you can buy a lobbyist and they will basically try to get the policies or the changes that you need. And in the US in particular, we've seen that the taxation, the changes in the fiscal system over the last decades have been really all to the benefit of the richest. There is a book written by an activist group in the US called the Patriotic Millionaires. It's called, I'm not entirely, I think it's called Tax the Rich. And they document chapter after chapter how the richest in the US lobbied for changes in the fiscal legislation that basically make that right now the richest pay fewer taxes than the next deciles, and that has to do because the differences in how much Americans pay in taxes on income from labor versus capital gains or profits. And so that's another way in which, if you have money, you can use it to undermine democracy.
Now, you also point out in the book another way that we sort of don't discuss that much, which is you can essentially buy your way into a country. You can buy your way across international borders.
Yes. So there's this phenomenon called golden passports. If you start searching on the internet, you read, and a whole world opens up to you, where if you just have enough money, you can just buy a passport. And the passports that are very much wanted are European Union passports, because if you have a passport, for example, Malta, which is a very small country and an island in Europe, you have, because of European Union treaties, you have access to live and work in any European Union country. So you can move to Germany or to whatever other country you want to go to. And lots of Russians have bought these European passports. And of course, at some point, there was a problem because they thought there were, of course, because of the war and the sanctions. And that is, I think, is really problematic. But there's really crazy cases like Peter Thiel, who is German from origin, now is also American. He acquired New Zealand citizenship. And the reason is that he wanted to buy a plot of land so that in case of catastrophe, he can take his private jet and fly to New Zealand, and there in his own bubble next to unspoiled land and unspoiled water, he can survive the apocalypse. But the problem is that in New Zealand, in order to buy land, you have to be a citizen. It's very hard for anybody to get land there. But he managed. He was 12 days in New Zealand before he acquired citizenship. So political groups then started to complain, and they found out that the reason he was granted citizenship is because of service to the economy of New Zealand.
In other words, being
donations,
rich.
yeah. So
yeah. And it's especially tragic and cruel when you see, the number of people without any money who are trying to get into the United States at our southern border, people fleeing violence and poverty. All they want is to come and do low wage work and live a peaceful life, and they can't get across the border. But the moment you flash the wallet and you're Peter Thiel, they go, "Oh, sir, what country would you like to live in?"
Yeah, no, it's really true that we have different rules for ordinary people and different rules for poor people and different rules for the super rich. Yeah.
Now, you mentioned Peter Thiel's private jet, which gets us to another one of your chapters, which is that our grotesque distribution of wealth is now causing a planetary catastrophe.
Yeah. So in theory, it is possible to be super rich and not to use that money to damage the environment and damage the planet. But that's a theoretical possibility. What we see is that the super rich pollute vastly more than other groups. And so there is a set of figures that I think is really illuminating. And that is you could say the carbon footprint. So the average carbon footprint of an American citizen is somewhere around, so it depends a bit on the source you use, but somewhere around 20 tons CO2 per year per person. In African countries, except the north, where you have some oil states, and South Africa, it's around 1 ton CO2 per year. For the super rich on Earth, all the super rich, the 1%, it is 101 tons. But if we go to the billionaires and we only look at their lifestyles, we get to numbers of 8,000 tons, 10,000 tons. And then we haven't yet talked about how their investments are also contributing to pollution. So it is, and then the people who did this research, they look at things such as private yachts, mansions, second, third, fourth homes. All these things are just... And in the case of private jets, I'm increasingly thinking, and this is not an original thought because others have argued this too, perhaps we should just abolish them.
Yeah.
As long as we don't have a CO2 neutral way to fly privately,
right.
I don't see how they can justify...
Right. Because it hurts the rest of, you could justify banning private jets even on a pretty free market theory, which is that, you're allowed to regulate markets when there are these externalities, these harms and costs that your activity within the market imposes on others, which obviously private jets do.
But even this particular theory of internalizing the externalities, it is true that is what standard economic theory says. If you internalize the negative externalities into the price, which we could do by having a carbon tax, then the problem might be solved. But actually, that particular theory was built on the assumption that inequality was not significant. Once you have significant inequality, you might actually have to go to models of rationing rather than including the effect in the price. So this is also something like this idea of internalizing the externality in the price, which I'm all in favor for, has become like the magic solution. But actually, suppose somebody like, just call somebody, Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk, suppose we say that they should pay $100 per 1,000 miles they fly.
What does it mean to them? Yeah.
They will laugh at us and throw some money.
They're not going to change the behavior. They're just going to pay the fee because it's meaningless. So
absolutely.
The idea here is, okay, well, we'll discourage them by forcing them to pay the costs of the harm they're doing. But if you can just pay for harm, then...
It's what economists, it's a technical thing, but they would just call it the income effect. They have so much income, income as in their case also wealth, that it's going to affect the middle classes who will no longer be able to fly. And I think we should all, of course, think twice or 3 times before flying. But if you have so much money, I really think all these measures also... In the case of politics, you have another measure that you could advocate, which is to try to, with regulation, try to make sure that money from a privileged position in the economic sphere, so say having a lot of money, can't buy you a privileged position in the political sphere. And one way to do this is by having campaign legislation. I think that's very good. Actually, my own country, the Netherlands, recently introduced a law that each person can maximally give 100,000 euros per year to political parties. 100,000 euros. So I think if you were to apply this to the US, there's going to be a lot of people in trouble.
Yeah.
But what we see is that then they try to find ways around this.
Of course.
They start a foundation, then all these entrepreneurs give 1 million, and then the foundation, which is not a person, but is an organization and not for profit or something like that. And the same way, of course, with the super PACs and everything in the US. So I think that really as long as some people have such a disproportionate amounts of money and hence also power, they're going to try to avoid and evade and change these regulations.
Right. And so as I take it, what you're saying is that's why you ultimately come to the conclusion that you've got to put limits, you got to put an upper limit on the amount of wealth that can be possessed.
Yeah, that's my argument. I just think these other values, basically survival of the human species on Earth, so ecological sustainability and political equality, democracy, and having your basic needs met are just so much more important than addictions of the super rich. And I want to stress that I do think we should take incentives seriously in the sense that, yes, people who work harder should be able to earn more and so forth. But the incentive argument is also not endlessly. We can also find ways to reward people and to show our respect for what people have done in other ways than only letting them accumulate more money. I mean, the whole system of giving prizes in academia, of giving honorary degrees, is all to show your respect and admiration and hence acknowledge the work that people put in, but they don't get any more money.
Right. And I think most people who innovate would say that they don't do it for the the money anyway.
Yeah, but then it's in tension really with then the argument that they say, but you shouldn't tax me too much because, if
you tax me too much, I won't do it. Yeah, but also I don't do it for the money. So this gets us to, you discuss in the book, just to conclude here, you talk in the book about how when you start to talk about limits, people often mischaracterize you kind of in bad faith and say, this is communism, right? But what you've been saying there is that even if we accept the idea of a limit, the limit can be still set quite high in the sense that you can still live very comfortably within the kinds of limits that we're talking about. And you've thought about, where should the limit be? And the limit is not like you should be able to earn a maximum of $12,000 a year. It is possible to have a range of incomes. It's still possible to have some level of inequality. So where do you end up thinking that the limits ought to be?
Yeah. So I should stress here that this is in part based on empirical research I did with colleagues where we did a survey among a representative sample of the Dutch population, where we asked them about we basically gave them descriptions of material lifestyles, and we asked them to where they would put, and these material lifestyles were, each case was in increasing amounts of wealth, and we asked them where would they say that somebody really has too much. And people do draw that line in between at different points, but almost all of them do draw the line somewhere, which means that the conceptual idea of having too much makes sense. It's not just an academic idea, it's really carried by the population. So based on that research, and also on all the research that I base my arguments on, I argue that for the Dutch context, one doesn't need more than 1 million per person to lead a really good life. But I say for the Dutch context, and we have two types of security that I do not think all Americans have, and that is healthcare. We have a we have a regulated healthcare system. So it's not like the British NHS, but it is private providers, but it's highly regulated and also subsidized by the government. And we also have, importantly, we have a collective pension system. And these two things, of course, take away two really big sources of anxiety and worries among citizens. So I can see that in the American context, you may have to put that limit higher.
Right, unless we get universal healthcare.
No, I think actually it's very much more rational to have universal healthcare and to to also think about having a pension system at the poverty line where people can still save for top-ups, but it's not the
Right.
but so,
people here do feel they have to accumulate in part because they feel precarious. They feel like it could all go away tomorrow and they could end up on the streets. Yeah.
No, so the way it works in the Netherlands to do with healthcare is, so we basically pay a monthly fee for healthcare. It's fixed. And so if I were to have a very serious disease, cancer or something like that, I mean, it will not affect me in financial terms. I will not have to pay extra. I will not have to sell my house. And that just gives you peace of mind.
Right.
That you know that if bad luck strikes, you know, it's actually rational to pool the risks of bad luck. Because that is actually a finding from economics, that if you have certain risks that are spread over the population, it's much more rational to pool those risks. And I think we should do that both with healthcare costs, but also we do not know how long we will live. So how can you know for how much you will have to pay for your pension? Because you may actually die at 67, but you may live until you're 99.
Right.
So it's much more rational to have those systems, I think, in a traditional welfare state, but that's anyway. I know that this is an argument that is not as easy to. I mean, I think that the argument is true, but it takes a lot, I guess, to get there. But that I should say that what I've said so far is what I think you need for a fully flourishing life. So basically, a really good life. And then there is a question: where should we put the political limit? How we should organize the economic system so that we try to make sure this is where we end the inequality.
Yeah.
And this is difficult for me to guess because I don't have solid research to base myself on there. But I've proposed in the book 10 million. So that gives you the scope for the incentives for people to innovate, to work hard, to take risks and so on.
Sure.
I mean, people may argue, no, 10 million is too low. We should put it at 50,
but it's a lot of money.
But I want to say it's not 1 billion.
Right.
So there are
it's
people,
including
Bernie Sanders, who say we shouldn't have billionaires. I think that statement is not ambitious enough. It's not just we shouldn't have billionaires. We shouldn't have, I would say, deca-millionaires, but you could say centimillionaires. It's really not necessary to have so much money.
Right. Yeah, it's an awful lot. It's an awful lot of money, even if you set it at a quote low level. Well, people really ought to pick up the book Limitarianism, the case against extreme wealth, which Thomas Piketty calls a must read, which I think it is because you go through a lot of the most common and, to me, kind of annoying arguments that we hear in defense of the accumulation of extreme wealth. And, you're a political philosopher, but you've also done a lot of, as you say, empirical research. You draw from economics and sociology in dealing with some of this stuff, and you help us think through some of the most serious questions of our time about what is it legitimate to have, what kind of society do we want, and how do we get there. So we can't cover everything that is in the book today, and that's why people need to pick it up. The book is Limitarianism, the Case Against Extreme Wealth by Professor Ingrid Robeyns. Professor Robeyns, thank you so much for joining us on Current Affairs today.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed the conversation.
The Current Affairs Podcast is a product of Current Affairs Magazine. If you are not subscribed to Current Affairs Magazine, visit currentaffairs.org/subscribe today and get our glorious print edition. The Current Affairs Podcast is released regularly every week on patreon.com/currentaffairs. Thanks for listening.